There's a golden rule of childhood that we all eventually break: be home before the streetlights come on. When we are young, the dark is a playground. It transforms the mundane spaces of our daylight hours into something thrilling. The local park, the patch of woods behind the subdivision, the empty cul-de-sac, these places become ours when the adults retreat indoors. There is a reason our parents told us to come inside. Because when the sun goes down, the world doesn't just empty out. It makes room for other things. Things that thrive in the shadows. Things that are waiting for you to wander just a little too far from the porch light. Tonight, we have 3 stories about the places we thought were safe. 3 reminders that the dark does not belong to us. Lock your doors, check your windows, and listen closely. Story 1. The voice in the metal. If you grew up before smartphones tethered us to our bedrooms, you know the drill. Summer nights were spent on bicycles, roaming the neighborhood like feral packs of dogs. I was 13 years old, right in the sweet spot of that era, where a bicycle was a passport to absolute freedom. It was a Saturday night. My core group of friends and I had spent the early evening doing the usual, destroying greasy slices at the local pizzeria and killing time in my buddy Tony's backyard. But around 9 o'clock, Tony's mom hit her limit. She leaned out the back door and delivered the ultimatum: quiet down, go home, or go somewhere else. Half the group opted to call it a night, but Tony, our friend Rob, and I weren't ready to throw in the towel. The night air was too perfect. So, we hopped on our bikes and pedaled toward our designated sanctuary, the neighborhood park. It was only a 5-minute ride. The park was ideal for teenage loitering because it was practically a fortress. It was bordered on 3 sides by dense, untamed woods. The 4th side faced a quiet street, which itself looked out onto more woods. There were no nosy neighbors to peer through their blinds. Right. No one to dial the cops if we got too loud. It was entirely isolated. The park had a small, dusty baseball diamond, a set of rusted bleachers, and a sprawling, multi-level playground structure. We always gravitated toward the playground. It was elevated, shadowy, and offered a great vantage point. We ditched our bikes in the grass and climbed up into the plastic tubes and metal platforms. We were just sitting there, talking about nothing, soaking in the quiet. Suddenly, Tony stopped mid-sentence. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. "Robin." I went dead silent. We strained our ears against the night air. The woods were quiet. The street was empty. "Hear what?" I asked. Tony frowned. I thought I heard a footstep. Like a heavy thump. Light. On the playground. We all did a quick visual sweep. The moonlight illuminated the slides and the swings. There was absolutely no one there. We brushed it off, assuming it was just the metal structure settling as it cooled down from the daytime heat. We resumed our conversation. But a few minutes later, it happened again. This time, Rob and I heard it too. It was distinct. It was the hollow, vibrating sound of a heavy boot landing on the hard plastic of the playground equipment, and it came from the lower level, right beneath us. The casual atmosphere evaporated. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. We weren't alone. We quietly scrambled to our feet, creeping to the edge of the platform to peer down into the shadows. We didn't see a soul. Emboldened by numbers, I called out into the dark. "Who's down there?" Nothing. Just the rustle of the wind in the trees. Feeling a mix of paranoia and foolishness, we settled back down. "It's just an animal," we told ourselves. "A raccoon on the lower deck." We sat in silence for another agonizing minute, and then the 3rd sound broke the quiet. It wasn't a thud. It wasn't a footstep. It was a voice. It was the high-pitched, delicate voice of a small child, a toddler, and the acoustics were unmistakable. It was echoing from inside the spiral metal slide attached to our platform. Mate. My blood ran completely cold. We stared at each other, our eyes wide with genuine terror. We had been sitting there for 30 minutes. We had a clear view of the slide's entrance and exit. No one had climbed the stairs. No one had walked across the wood chips. I slowly crawled over to the dark, gaping mouth of the metal tube before that night. I swallowed hard and leaned my head near the opening. "Is someone in there?" I whispered. The response was immediate. It echoed up the metal tunnel, distorted but perfectly clear. "Hello." It was a little boy. Mate. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was impossible. The logistics made absolutely zero sense. But the maternal, protective instinct kicked. If a toddler was somehow stuck inside an arc slide in the middle of the night, we had to get him out. I leaned closer into the opening. "Do you need help?" Mate. Silence. Mate. I waited. Nothing. I assumed the kid was paralyzed with fear. Taking a deep breath, I swung my legs into the slide. I pushed off, spiraling down into the darkness of the metal tube, fully bracing myself to collide with a small, terrified child halfway down. I hit the wood chips at the bottom. The slide was completely empty. I scrambled to my feet, spinning around wildly, scanning the ground level of the playground. I checked under the platforms. I checked the swings. I checked the shadows of the nearby trees. Nut. The park was utterly deserted. I looked up at Tony and Rob. They were staring down at me, their faces pale in the moonlight. "There's nobody here," I stammered. It was physically impossible for a toddler to have exited that slide and vanished into the thick woods in the 2 seconds it took me to slide down. Wait. We were officially terrified. We decided it was time to leave. But as we turned to grab our bikes, the voice echoed from the metal slide one final time. "Catch me." We didn't speak. We didn't hesitate. Pure, unadulterated panic hijacked our nervous systems. We practically threw ourselves onto our bikes and pedaled so fast my lungs burned. We didn't look back until we hit the safety of my driveway, tearing into the backyard and slamming the heavy wooden gate shut behind us. We collapsed onto the patio furniture, gasping for air, our minds frantically trying to process the impossibility of what we had just experienced. We kept our voices to frantic whispers, terrified of waking my sleeping father inside the house. But the nightmare wasn't over. Knock. 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 Like, knock. The sound came from the wooden gate we had just locked. It wasn't a frantic pounding. It was a polite, measured knock, like someone asking permission to enter. Wait, we froze. Mike, was it my dad coming around from the front? Was it a neighbor complaining about the noise? "Who is that?" I called out, my voice shaking it. From the other side of the heavy wood, a woman's voice replied. It was smooth, calm, and entirely unfamiliar. "Hello," she said. "Were you guys just at the park before?" A sickening wave of dread washed over me. Between the wooden slats of the gate and the fence post, there was a tiny, half-inch vertical crack. I slowly crept toward the gate and pressed my eye against the sliver of space. Standing on the other side, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of the street lamp, was a middle-aged woman. But she wasn't looking at the latch. She wasn't looking at the wood. She had her eye pressed directly against the crack on the other side. She was staring dead into my eye. And she was smiling. It was a wide, unnerving, impossibly stretched grin that did not reach her dead eyes. She looked like a predator that had cornered its prey. I violently recoiled from the fence, my breath catching in my throat. The sight of that face was profoundly disturbing. "No," I lied, my voice cracking. "Sorry." "Are you sure?" The woman turned through the wood. Tony, bless his terrified heart, stepped up. "No, we weren't," he barked, trying to sound older. "Okay, thanks anyway," the woman replied softly. I waited 10 agonizing seconds. I crept back to the crack, praying she had walked away. She hadn't moved an inch. She was still standing there, still staring through the gap, still wearing that horrific, frozen smile. We'd broke. We abandoned the bikes in the yard, quietly unlocked the back door of my house, and barricaded ourselves in the basement for the rest of the night. Neither Tony nor Rob would even consider walking home. They slept on the floor, terrified that the smiling woman was still standing at the gate, waiting for the sun to come up. Wait, we didn't go back to that park for years. If you force me to find a rational explanation, you could argue it was a runaway child and a desperate mother looking for him. But that logic crumbles under scrutiny. We rode out of that park at a dead sprint. No one on foot could have tracked us back to my house that fast, and we know that slide was empty. So what did we hear echoing in the meadow? And who was the woman waiting at the gate? I'm an adult now, but sometimes when I pass a playground at night, I still catch myself looking at the slides, terrified I might hear a tiny voice asking me to play. Story 2. The Silent Metronome. We all have our rituals. The small, quiet routines we rely on to decompress when the world gets too loud. For our next narrator, that ritual was a simple evening walk. It was the summer of 2018. She lived in a quintessential, sleepy suburban town. The kind of place where violent crime is a rumor, and walking alone after dark is considered perfectly safe. She had just finished a brutal, exhausting late shift at work. Her mind was buzzing, her muscles tight. She needed to clear her head before returning to the confinement of her apartment. Just a few blocks away lay the local park, a sprawling green space she frequented for jogging and solitary walks. The sun had been down for over an hour. The park's amber street lamps cast long, distorted shadows across the paved walking paths. It was a beautiful night. The air was thick with the comforting scent of freshly cut grass, and the park was almost entirely deserted. She slipped her earbuds in, keeping the volume low enough to maintain situational awareness, and stepped onto the main path. For the first 10 minutes, it was therapeutic. A few distant dog walkers. Light, the faint murmur of teenagers on a far-off bench. It was the peaceful isolation she craved. But peace in the dark is fragile. The unease began subtly. As she rounded a gentle curve in the path, she noticed a man sitting alone on a wooden bench just off the trail. He was wearing a dark, heavy hoodie. The hood was pulled up, obscuring his features entirely, despite the oppressive summer humidity. He wasn't reading. He wasn't looking at a phone. He was just sitting there, completely rigid, staring straight ahead. As she walked past, the hairs on her arms pricked. She could feel his gaze lock onto her. He didn't turn his head, but his eyes tracked her movement with a predatory intensity. She instinctively quickened her pace, chalking it up to the harmless eccentricity of a stranger. She walked another 50 yards. The bench faded into the dark behind her. Then, she heard it. Scuff. Step. Footsteps on the pavement behind her. She paused. The footsteps instantly stopped. She held her breath, waiting for the person to pass her. Nothing happened. The silence stretched. She began walking again. Scuff. Step. The footsteps resumed, but they weren't the erratic, uneven steps of a casual walker. They were a metronome. They were perfectly, precisely matching her exact cadence. Every time her foot hit the asphalt, the heavy footfall behind her echoed it a fraction of a second later. Panic flared in her chest. She needed to break his line of sight. Up ahead, a narrower, unlit-eyed trail branched off from the main path, looping back toward the residential streets. It was darker, but it was a faster route home. She took the turn, As she did, she threw a quick glance over her shoulder. The man in the hoodie had stood up from the bench. He was walking down the main path, heading directly toward the side trail she had just taken. He wasn't jogging. He wasn't hurrying. He was moving with a slow, deliberate, terrifyingly smooth gait. It was the movement of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Desperate to project confidence, she pulled her phone from her pocket and pressed it to her ear, faking a loud, animated conversation. It's the universal signal for, I am connected. Someone knows exactly where I am. But the man didn't flinch. He didn't slow down. He simply turned onto the dark side trail, perfectly maintaining the distance between them. The fake phone call wasn't working. The walking wasn't working. She broke into a light jog. Instantly, the heavy footsteps behind her shifted rhythm, accelerating into a synchronized jog. He was matching her speed perfectly, ensuring she couldn't build a gap. The situation had escalated from creepy to critical. She abandoned the path entirely. Up ahead, she saw the faint glow of the streetlight marking the park exit. She broke into a dead, terrified sprint. The footsteps behind her pounded against the pavement, matching her speed. He wasn't trying to catch her, not yet. He was maintaining the chase, letting the terror exhaust her. Her lungs burned. Her vision dwindled. She burst out of the tree line and onto the illuminated sidewalk of the residential street. She slowed her pace, gasping for air, and finally dared to look back. The man had stopped. He was standing precisely on the boundary line where the streetlight met the shadows of the park. He was a black silhouette against the trees, the hood still completely obscuring his face. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stood in the dark, watching her tremble under the streetlight. She turned and ran the rest of the way to her apartment, fumbling violently with her keys before throwing the deadbolt and collapsing against the door. For days, she tried to gaslight herself. It was a misunderstanding. He was just walking the same way. I overreacted. Desperate to reclaim her sense of security, she returned to the park a few days later, in the blinding safety of the mid-afternoon sun. She walked the same path, trying to overwrite the fear. She reached the bench where the man had been sitting. It was empty, but as she looked closer, her stomach violently dropped. Carved fresh into the weathered wood of the bench, right where the man had been sitting, were deep, jagged scratches. It looked like someone had frantically dug a blade into the timber, attempting to carve letters, before violently smearing and destroying them to make them illegible. It was a chaotic, violent mark left behind by someone who was not of sound mind. She snapped a photo and practically ran out of the park. The paranoia set in like a disease. She stopped walking at night entirely, but the terror had infected her neighborhood. She began seeing shadows in her peripheral vision. She would spot a figure standing across the street, only for it to vanish when she turned her head. Unfamiliar cars seemed to linger at the end of her block. She convinced herself she was losing her mind, until one early evening, 2 weeks later, she decided to go for a run before the sun went down. She strictly avoided the park, sticking to the paved sidewalks of the main street. As she jogged past the heavy, dense tree line that bordered the park's edge, her blood ran cold. Standing just inches inside the thick brush, perfectly camouflaged in the deepening shadows, was a figure. It was the same height, the same build, the same heavy, dark hoodie pulled up over the head. He was standing completely motionless, staring out at the street, staring at her. He hadn't followed her. He had been waiting. He had figured out her new route, and he had simply stood in the trees, waiting for her to run past. She froze on the sidewalk. Her instincts screamed at her to flee, but her body felt heavy, locked in a primal standoff with a predator. She forced herself to back away slowly, never breaking eye contact with the shadow in the trees. until she reached Herc R. She threw herself inside, locked the doors, and sped away, checking her rearview mirror until her eyes burned. She never saw him again. She checked with the local authorities, who reviewed the sparse security footage around the park entrances. But no dark figure entering or leaving on the nights in question. He either knew exactly where the camera blind spots were, or he was living deep inside the park itself, unseen by the rest of the world. She never filed a formal police report. How do you report a ghost? A man who never spoke, never touched her, never overtly threatened her. All he did was walk behind her in the dark. But that is the true horror of the Stalker. It's the profound, suffocating uncertainty. Who was he? White. And most terrifying of all. Like, where is he now? To this day, when she sits in her locked apartment at night, she strains her ears against the silence. And sometimes, just barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator, she swears she can hear the faint, rhythmic scuff, step of heavy boots on the pavement outside. White, waiting in the dark. Story 3. The Hunting Grounds. For our final story, we move from the slow, creeping dread of a solitary stalker to the explosive, chaotic terror of a coordinated hunt. It happened less than 24 hours before the narrator documented the event. The adrenaline was still pumping through his veins as he wrote it down. It was a late weekend night hovering around 11. Like 0 p.m. Our narrator and 5 of his closest friends were looking for a place to kill time. They drove up to a popular local park known as the Overlook. It earned its name for its sweeping, panoramic views of the downtown skyline and the sprawling university campuses below. It was intended to be a low-key night. Just 6 guys sitting on the hoods of their cars, talking trash and enjoying the view. But the agenda shifted when one of the friends casually mentioned he had a stash of Roman candles rattling around in the trunk of his car. Boys will be boys, and the temptation to shoot flaming projectiles into the night sky was too strong to ignore. However, the Overlook was highly visible. Lighting fireworks there was a guaranteed way to get a noise complaint and a visit from the local police. The narrator, thinking practically, suggested they relocate. Just a few minutes down the road was a different section of the park, known locally as the Loop. The Loop was essentially a massive, isolated cul-de-sac buried deep inside a thick fortress of trees. The access road was a long, winding driveway that completely severed the Loop from the main road. If you were inside the Loop, the dense real light made it impossible for anyone on the street to see what you were doing. It was the perfect spot for illicit fireworks. The 6 friends piled into 2 cars and made the short Dr. drive. Cautious about getting boxed in, they decided to park their vehicles on the main street just outside the entrance, choosing to walk the long, winding driveway into the Loop on foot. As they walked deeper into the darkness of the cul-de-sac, they noticed something odd. Night. There were several cars parked haphazardly around the circular blacktop, but the engines were cut, and the headlights were off. The Loop was pitch black. While it wasn't entirely abnormal for people to use the park late at night, the sheer number of darkened vehicles sitting in total silence felt deeply unsettling. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the crunch of gravel. A small pickup truck, parked facing the exit, suddenly rolled forward. Its headlights remained entirely off. The truck abruptly whipped into a tight U-turn and began creeping directly toward the group of friends in the dark. The teenage bravado instantly evaporated. The 6 friends scrambled off the asphalt, diving behind the thick trunks of the oak trees lining the road. The darkened truck crawled past their hiding spot at a snail's pace. It completed the circle around the Loop, headed back toward the entrance, suddenly slammed on its brakes, and dripped another violent U-turn. It was circling them. The dread was palpable. The truck was small, a single cab that could barely fit 3 people. The 6 friends were all athletes, all standing over 6 feet tall. By all logical metrics, they had the physical advantage. Yet, The predatory, silent movements of the dark truck terrified them. But logic often fails in the face of panic. And one of the friends, misreading the tension of the room entirely, decided this was the perfect moment to break the ice. He struck a lighter and ignited a Roman candle. A shower of brilliant, screaming sparks erupted into the pitch-black sky, illuminating the trees and completely exposing their position. Wait. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. The truck's high beams violently flicked on, blinding the group in a wash of harsh white light. The driver laid on the horn, a blaring, aggressive wail, and slammed the accelerator. The truck didn't stay on the road. It hopped the concrete curb, tearing up the manicured grass, driving straight at the tree line where the boys were standing. The hunt had begun. The boys broke. They turned and sprinted blindly into the dense, unkempt woods. Light. This wasn't a hiking trail. It was a steep, downward slope choked with thick briars, low-hanging branches, and waist-high grass. They crashed through the underbrush, the roar of the truck's engine right on their heels. About 20 feet deep into the woods, the terrifying reality of the situation multiplied. The sound of the truck's engine was suddenly joined by the roar of other vehicles. Through the trees, the boys saw multiple pairs of headlights suddenly ignite around the dark cul-de-sac. Light. They hadn't just angered one driver. They had disturbed a hornet's nest. In the chaotic sprint, the group fractured. The narrator found himself sliding down a steep embankment with only two of his friends. The other three were completely gone. Above them, the heavy thud of truck doors slamming shut echoed through the trees. "Get down," the narrator hissed. The three boys threw themselves into the dirt. The narrator managed to wedge his large frame beneath the thick, thorny canopy of a massive bush. His two friends lay flat in the tall grass, dangerously exposed. From the lip of the embankment above, the blinding beams of high-powered flashlights began sweeping through the trees. Two men had exited the truck and were physically descending into the woods. Night. The boys held their breath, pressing their faces into the damp earth. The beams of light danced inches from their heads. They could hear the heavy boots of the men crushing the dry leaves just a few yards away. But the terror compounded. From the front of their position, deeper in the woods, another set of flashlights clicked on. They were surrounded. One group was hunting them from the high ground of the parking lot, and another group was sweeping the woods from below. The narrator lay in the dirt, his mind reeling. Over fireworks. It made absolutely no sense. The sparks hadn't hit a vehicle. Fireworks were perfectly legal in their state. The sheer, coordinated aggression of the response felt deeply, inherently criminal. They hadn't interrupted a quiet night. They had interrupted something else. For 15 agonizing minutes, the boys lay completely paralyzed in the mud while the beams of light swept over them. Finally, the shouting ceased. The men trudged back up the embankment. The truck engine roared, the tires spun in the wet grass, and the vehicle tore out of the loop. The other headlights systematically clicked off, plunging the cul-de-sac back into darkness. The boys didn't move for another 10 minutes. When they finally dared to breathe, a new problem arose. One of the friends frantically patted his pockets. His phone had slipped out during the fall. By some miracle, they found the glowing screen a few feet away in the grass. But the true challenge was extracting themselves from the sunken woods and making it back to the street without being spotted. They couldn't use flashlights. They couldn't use their phones. They had to navigate the treacherous, thorny incline in absolute blackness. As they crested the hill, a figure suddenly detached from the shadows of a nearby tree. The boys nearly screamed, but it was one of their missing friends. He was pale and trembling. He whispered that during the chaos, he had hidden behind a thick oak tree. One of the men searching the woods had walked within 3 feet of him. And in the ambient light of the flashlight, The friend had seen what the man was holding. It wasn't a baseball bat. It wasn't a tire iron. It was a massive, fixed-blade hunting knife. The blood drained from the narrator's face. These men weren't looking to rough up some teenagers over a noise complaint. They were hunting to kill. The survival instinct hit maximum overdrive. The four boys abandoned all attempts at stealth and broke into a dead sprint down the long winding driveway toward the main road. As they neared the exit, the narrator's heart stopped. Idling on the shoulder of the road, 50 feet from the park entrance, was the pickup truck. They were waiting for them to emerge. The boys violently veered off the asphalt, plunging into a thick patch of woods that bordered the street, desperate to use the tree cover to flank the truck. But the driver was watching. The high beams flared to life, flooding the tree line with blinding light. The truck's engine revved aggressively, and it lurched forward, tracking the boys' movements from the road. The boys didn't look back. They pushed through the tearing thorns and branches, running deeper and deeper into the forest, prioritizing distance over direction. They ran until their lungs burned. They ran until the sound of the truck engine faded into the ambient noise of the city. They eventually broke out onto a different main thoroughfare, miles away from the loop. Paranoid and exhausted, they took a convoluted maze of back alleys and side streets to finally return to their parked cars. It wasn't until hours later, as the sun began to rise, that they finally heard from the last two members of their group. They had managed to outrun the search party early on and had spent the night hiding in a local diner. The narrator will never go back to the Overlook. He will never go back to the loop. He doesn't know what kind of illicit meeting they interrupted that night in the dark. A drug deal. A gang initiation. Something worse. All he knows is that for 30 minutes in the pitch-black woods, he and his friends were no longer humans hanging out in a park. They were prey. We build parks and playgrounds to give ourselves the illusion of tame nature. But when the lights go out, the wild reclaims its territory. And the things waiting in the dark are not always animals. Be careful where you walk tonight. Until next time, welcome back. Dim the lights, check the locks, and settle in. New Year's Eve. It is a night universally recognized as a threshold. A gateway between what was and what will be. Millions of people gather together to drink, to celebrate, and to count down the final seconds of the calendar year, believing that the stroke of midnight will somehow wash away the sins of the past and offer a clean slate. We surround ourselves with noise and light to keep the darkness at bay. But thresholds are dangerous things. When the door between the old year and the new year swings open, sometimes, things manage to slip through. Things that do not belong. Tonight, we are going to explore 3 distinct accounts centered around that exact night. 3 different stories from people who found themselves standing on the edge of the new year, only to look into the dark and realize something terrifying was looking back. Take a deep breath. Wait, let's begin. We start on a lonely stretch of asphalt, deep in the dead of winter. Memory is a fragile, fragmented thing, especially when it is laced with trauma. The man who submitted this first account admits that his timeline is a little blurred. Maybe it was 7 years ago, maybe 8. The chaos of his life since that night has scrambled the finer details. But the core of the event, light, the visceral, blood-freezing reality of what happened. Light, that is etched into his mind forever. It was New Year's Eve. He and his girlfriend at the time, a woman named Duda, were making the long trek home from a holiday party. It was a last-minute invitation to a friend's house, which meant all the couches and spare beds had already been claimed. Exhausted, freezing, and out of options, they were forced to make the drive back to Duda's place. It was well past midnight. You do not need me to tell you that navigating the roads in the early hours of New Year's Day is a gamble. The world is full of intoxicated drivers, reckless decisions, and tragedy waiting to happen. But they had no choice. The drive was slated to take roughly 30 minutes. The world outside the windshield was a frozen wasteland. It had snowed heavily earlier in the afternoon, leaving the empty streets slicked with a treacherous, invisible layer of black ice. The absolute desolation of the road was the only saving grace. There was no oncoming traffic to dodge. Inside the car, the heater was roaring, fighting back the bitter cold pressing against the glass. Duda was slumped in the passenger seat, dead to the world, lulled into a deep sleep by the hum of the engine. The narrator had a random rock playlist turned up loud, gripping the steering wheel, fighting the heavy pull of exhaustion behind his own eyes. The rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers was hypnotic. They were perhaps 10 minutes away from the safety of Duda's apartment. Light. The nightmare began. There is no elegant way to describe the sudden, violent intrusion of the impossible into everyday life. 1 second, the headlights were illuminating nothing but an empty, snow-dusted road. Like the next second, a figure materialized in the high beams. It was a woman. She was not crossing the street. She was not walking along the shoulder. She was standing dead center, in the middle of his lane. Her body was squared up, facing the approaching vehicle directly, completely motionless. It looked exactly as though she had been waiting for them. The human brain is not wired to process this kind of anomaly at 60 miles per hour. For a fraction of a second, his mind simply rejected the image, but his foot reacted before his conscious thought caught up, slamming down on the brake pedal. As the car began to skid, the headlights washed fully over her. He saw her hands. Specifically, he saw what she was holding down by her side. It was a knife. Not a picket knife, not a switchblade. It was a massive, heavy kitchen knife, the kind of blade designed to cleave through bone and muscle. And then, he saw her face. It was a mask of absolute, deranged fury. Her features were twisted, her mouth stretched wide open in a silent, agonizing scream, tears streaming down her face. It was a sickening, unnatural expression. Adrenaline flooded his system. In a desperate bid to save both of their lives, he violently cranked the steering wheel to the right, aiming for the empty shoulder. But, as the nose of the car veered away, the woman did not flinch. She did not jump out of the way. She lunged at the car. He didn't see the impact, but he heard it. Over the blaring rock music, over the screech of the tires, he heard the sickening, heavy thud of the knife blade striking the metal of the car as they blew past her. She had actively swung the weapon at the driver's side door. The violent swerve, combined with the treacherous sheet of ice coating the asphalt, was a recipe for disaster. The tires completely lost their grip. The heavy vehicle became an uncontrolled projectile, spinning wildly into the dark. The world blurred into a chaotic smear of white snow and black night. Duda jolted awake, instantly hysterical, her screams filling the cabin. The narrator was White K and UC clinging the steering wheel, but it was useless. Physics had taken over. The car spun a violent, dizzying 180 degrees before finally slamming to a violent halt on the shoulder of the road. For a second, there was nothing but the sound of their own rag breathing and the idling engine. They were alive. They hadn't hit a tree. They hadn't rolled. But then, the narrator looked up through the windshield. Because the car had spun completely around, they were now facing the exact direction they had just come from. His headlights were piercing the darkness, illuminating the road behind them. And standing roughly 30 feet away, bathed in the harsh halogen light, was the woman. She was still clutching the massive knife, and she was moving toward them. She was limping heavily, dragging one leg behind her as if it were broken or severely injured, but she was closing the distance with terrifying determination. The silent scream she had worn earlier was no longer silent. She was shrieking. It wasn't words. It wasn't language. It was a guttural, raw, animalistic roaring that echoed over the frozen landscape. Judah was screaming at him, practically clawing at his arm, begging him to drive, to do something, to get them out of there. but he was paralyzed. The sheer, overwhelming terror of the sight had short-circuited his nervous system. He watched her lurch closer. Her clothes were filthy, shredded in places, hanging off her frame. Her hair was a wild, matted tangle of grease and dirt, but the most horrifying detail was her eyes. Even from a distance, he could see there was absolutely no human recognition in them. Whether it was severe psychosis, a catastrophic drug trip, or something entirely unexplainable, the entity behind those eyes was gone. She looked like a reanimated corpse dragging itself across the pavement. 15 feet. She was only 15 feet away when the paralysis finally broke. His survival instincts roared to life. He slammed the gearshift into drive and stomped the accelerator to the floor. Night. The engine howled. For one agonizing, heart-stopping second, the tires just spun uselessly on the black ice, whining against the frozen pavement. Night. Then they caught. The car lunged forward. He thought it was over. He thought the sudden acceleration would leave her in the dust. He was wrong. To this day, he cannot explain how a woman dragging a shattered leg moved with such explosive speed. 1 second she was in the road, and the next, there was a deafening, metallic crash. She threw her entire body onto the hood of the moving car. The vehicle violently shuddered under her weight. Duda's screams reached a deafening, hysterical pitch. Light. The narrator was cursing wildly, blinded by panic. The woman was splayed across the hood. Her left hand found purchase near the windshield wipers, gripping the metal with impossible strength. In her right hand, the massive kitchen knife rose into the air. Smash! She brought the heavy blade down directly into the windshield glass. Smash! Smash! Over and over again, the metal blade hacked into the safety glass, sending a spitterbear of cracks shooting across the narrator's field of vision. She was trying to break through. She was trying to butcher them inside the moving vehicle. He couldn't see the road. He couldn't think. Pure, blind panic took the wheel. He began to yank the steering wheel violently left and right, swerving the heavy car across the icy lanes in a desperate attempt to throw her off. The woman slid back and forth across the slick, freezing metal of the hood, but her grip held. She continued to scream that wordless, demonic sound. Her face was pressed mere inches from the shattered windshield. And through the cracked glass, she locked eyes with the narrator. She stared directly into his soul as she tried to kill him. He swerved a third time. Light. Then a fourth, throwing the car hard to the right. Finally, the physics were too much. Her grip broke. He watched in the rearview mirror as she tumbled off the side of the hood. She hit the frozen pavement with a brutal, sickening impact, her body rolling violently before sliding lifelessly onto the snowy shoulder. The car fishtailed, nearly spinning out again, but he fought the wheel, eventually wrestling the vehicle back under control. He kept driving, his heart threatening to hammer its way out of his ribcage. He looked in his mirror one last time. The woman was lying completely motionless on the side of the road, swallowed by the darkness. A terrible, heavy silence fell over the car. Despite the sheer, unadulterated horror he had just survived, human morality began to creep back in. He took his foot off the gas. He told Duda they needed to stop. He told her they needed to call the police, to call an ambulance. He reasoned that the woman was clearly suffering from a severe mental break. She needed help. And worse, he might have just killed her. Duda snapped. She grabbed his arm, her grip painful, and aggressively shut the idea down. She was shaking, but her voice was cold and commanding. She demanded that he keep driving. She insisted that it was not their problem, that they could not get involved. She reminded him that they had been drinking at the party. She told him that if the cops showed up, they would smell the alcohol, they would see a dead body, and they would not believe the story about a knife-wielding maniac. She convinced him that stopping meant throwing his own life away. Looking back now with years of clarity, he realizes how flawed her logic was. But, in that moment, running on adrenaline and shock, her persuasive, borderline manipulative urgency took root. He kept driving. He left the woman bleeding on the side of the freezing road. He drove Duda home, went back to his own apartment, and locked his doors. The aftermath of that night haunted him. The physical evidence was undeniable. A week later, he took the car to a shop to replace the spider-webbed windshield, fixed the deep, violent gouges the knife had carved into his driver's side door, and buff out the scratches on the hood. Miraculously, there had been no blood on the bumper. But the psychological damage could not be buffed out. For months, he obsessively scoured the local news, searching the internet every single morning for reports of a body found on that desolate stretch of road, or a story about a missing woman. There was nothing. Not a single word. He still doesn't know if the absence of a news report makes it better or worse. Did she miraculously survive the impact, pick herself up, and limp off into the frozen woods? Did someone else find her? He will never notice it. But what ultimately broke him wasn't the mystery of the woman. It was Duda. Within 48 hours of the incident, Duda was completely fine. She acted as though nothing had happened. She was making dinner reservations, texting friends, living her life with a chilling, sociopathic normalcy. When he finally broke down and tried to talk to her about the crushing guilt eating him alive, she rolled her eyes. She called him dramatic. She coldly stated that they did what they had to do, and told him to drop it. How do you look at someone you love and realize they are entirely unbothered by the fact that you both might have killed a human being? How do you accept that someone can brush off an attempted murder into days? They broke up a few months later. Officially, it was for unrelated reasons. But he knows the truth. That night permanently altered how he saw her. He knows he might have ended a life that night. He knows a deranged stranger came within inches of ending his. And as the years roll on, that is a ghost he continues to carry entirely on his own. Sometimes, the terror of New Year's Eve does not come from a knife in the dark. Sometimes, it comes from a quiet, impossible coincidence that shatters your fundamental understanding of reality. Consider the physics of space and time. We rely on them. We trust that a person cannot be in two places at once. We trust that the linear progression of hours and minutes is an unbreakable law of the universe. But what happens when that law is broken? Our next narrator attended the University of California, Berkeley, for his undergraduate degree. While there, he formed a deep, lasting friendship with a student from Hong Kong named Guo, though everyone just called him Garrett. Garrett was brilliant, a computer science major with a mind for numbers, logic, and undeniable facts. After graduation, the two friends went their separate ways. The narrator moved across the country to the bustling heart of New York City to build his career. Garrett returned home, to Hong Kong. Despite the massive geographical distance, they remained close, visiting each other once or twice a year, navigating the complexities of their late 20s as successful, single professionals. This brings us to last New Year's Eve. To understand the sheer impossibility of what is about to unfold, you must firmly grasp the time difference. Hong Kong is exactly 13 hours ahead of New York City. Wait, when the clock strikes midnight in Hong Kong, and the fireworks explode over Victoria Harbor, it is only 11. It's ROM on the morning of December 31st in New York. Garrett, living in Hong Kong, celebrated the turning of the year, went to a party, and lived out his New Year's Eve a full half day before his friend in America even put on a jacket. 12 hours later, the narrator was preparing for his own night out. He met up with two of his closest friends, Ryland and Dory, in Manhattan. They started the evening with drinks at an apartment before catching a cab over the bridge to a relatively upscale rooftop party in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. The party was loud, crowded, and vibrant. Around 11:30 p.m., with 30 minutes left in the year, the narrator was standing near the makeshift bar, when a woman caught his eye. She was standing alone, radiating a strange, magnetic energy. On a whim, he approached her and introduced himself. The connection was instantaneous. She was incredibly charismatic, funny, engaging, and remarkably easy to talk to. Within 5 minutes of meeting, she grabbed his hand and pulled him into the crowded dance floor. He asked her name over the heavy bass of the music. Maitrier, she said. He blinked, unfamiliar with the name, and asked her to repeat it. She laughed a bright, genuine sound, and told him that everyone just calls her Maitri because that's exactly how it sounds phonetically. He found the interaction incredibly charming. To ensure he didn't forget, she pulled a ballpoint pen from her purse, took his hand, and traced the letters of her name onto his skin. The night accelerated. They danced as the countdown began, and when the clock struck midnight, marking the arrival of the new year, they kissed. By 12:30 a.m., the crowded rooftop had lost its appeal. She leaned in and asked if he wanted to get out of there. They hailed an Uber, left Brooklyn, and headed back to his small, one-bedroom apartment in the East Village. It was, by all accounts, a wonderful night. They didn't just hook up. They stayed awake in the dark for hours, talking intimately, sharing the mundane and beautiful details of their lives. The narrator possesses a sharp memory, and he cataloged everything she told him. He learned that she was originally from San Diego, California. He learned that she was a working artist, specifically a painter, who had transitioned from doing illegal street graffiti and large-scale murals into more traditional gallery work. She told him her middle name was Mia. She laughed and admitted she had a cat also named Mia, along with a second cat named Cosmo. She mentioned her birthday was April 28th. She talked about her childhood best friend, a girl from a microscopic, obscure town in Germany called Hillesime. She complained briefly about her father, who worked as a strict patent lawyer. These are incredibly specific, deeply personal data points. At some point in the early hours of the morning, she mentioned that her clothes reeked of spilled drinks and smoke from the bar. Being a gracious host, he took her outfit and threw it in his washer and dryer. He pulled an oversized, comfortable t-shirt from his drawer and let her borrow it to sleep in. Eventually, exhaustion overtook them, and they drifted off to sleep side by side. When the narrator opened his eyes the next morning, the apartment was quiet. The winter sun was streaming through the blinds. He rolled over. The bed was empty. At first, he wasn't alarmed. Casual hookups in this way all the time. People wake up early, feel a sudden spike of awkwardness, and slip out the door before the other person wakes up. It wasn't a big deal. He stretched, threw off the covers, and walked out into the living room to use the bathroom. That was when he looked at his front door. The narrator's apartment had a very specific type of lock. It was a standard, old-school deadbolt. It did not lock automatically when the door shut. To lock it from the outside, you physically required a key. To lock it from the inside, you had to manually turn the heavy brass latch. The latch was turned. The deadbolt was fully engaged. The door was locked from the inside. He stopped dead in his tracks. A cold, uncomfortable prickle of confusion washed over him. If she had left the apartment, how did she lock the door behind her without a key? He checked the rest of the apartment. It did not take long. A small living room, a cramped kitchen, a tiny bathroom. There was no fire escape. There was no secondary exit. The windows were older, New York City fixtures, painted shut at the top and blocked by heavy metal security bars that prevented them from opening more than 3 inches. He looked in the kitchen. He opened the bathroom door. He even felt a wave of foolishness as he slid open his closet doors, half expecting her to jump out and scare him as a prank. She was not there. The apartment was entirely empty. The impossibility of the situation began to squeeze his lungs. He walked over to the laundry closet and opened the dryer. Her clothes were gone. He looked around the bedroom. The t-shirt he had lent her to sleep in was also gone. He began to pace the hardwood floor, his mind desperately grasping for a rational explanation. Had he imagined the entire night? Was it a bizarre, hyper-realistic alcohol-induced hallucination? No. He remembered the smell of her perfume. He remembered the specific timbre of her laugh. He remembered the ink from the pen she used to write on his hand. And yet, he was standing in a locked box, and she had vanished into thin air. He had no phone number, no social media handle, no way to contact her. He spent the entirety of New Year's Day trapped in a loop of his own thoughts. He sat on his couch, repeatedly listing the details she had told him, cementing them in his memory, terrified that if he forgot them, the night would truly become a delusion. San Diego, painter, graffiti, middle name Mia, cats Mia and Cosmo, April 28th, Hillersheim, Germany, patent lawyer dad. Late that afternoon, a strange, unexplainable urge washed over him. He felt an intense, burning compulsion to call Garrett in Hong Kong. He didn't know why. He didn't have anything specific he planned to say. It was just a gut instinct. He dialed the international number. Garrett answered. They exchanged the usual pleasantries, discussing their respective holidays. But Garrett sounded distracted. He sounded incredibly subdued. The narrator finally stopped and asked his friend what was wrong. Garrett let out a heavy sigh. He confessed that he had met an incredible girl the night before at a New Year's Eve party in Hong Kong. They had an amazing connection. She had come back to his apartment, and they had spent the night together. But when he woke up that morning, she was gone. She had slipped out without leaving a number, without saying goodbye, and he was genuinely crushed by it. The narrator chuckled, relieved by the mundane similarity of their situations. He told Garrett that the exact same thing had just happened to him in New York. Garrett paused. Then, he spoke the words that would shatter the narrator's reality forever. Garrett said, "Yeah, man. Her name was Maitre Yi. She told me to pronounce it like, my tree." A wave of absolute, freezing terror cascaded down the narrator's spine. The air in his apartment suddenly felt thin. He gripped the phone tighter, his knuckles turning white, his voice trembling. He demanded that Garrett describe her. Garrett, confused by the sudden intensity, began to list the things she had told him in the dark. She said her birthday was April 28th. Garrett said over the static of the international line. She's an American, from San Diego. She's an artist that used to do graffiti. The narrator couldn't let him finish it. He interrupted, practically shouting into the receiver. Did she have a cat named Mia? The line went dead silent. The silence stretched for 10 agonizing seconds. Finally, Garrett's voice came back, barely above a whisper. Yes, she has two, Mia and Cosmo. For the next 15 minutes, two grown men, separated by 8,000 miles and a massive ocean, sat on the phone and listed the exact same hyper-specific details about the woman they had both slept with the night before. Every single detail matched. The middle name, the best friend from Hillersheim, the patent lawyer father. It was a flawless, terrifying mirror image. Then, Garrett delivered the final, devastating piece of evidence. Unlike the narrator, Garrett had taken his phone out at the party in Hong Kong. He had taken a selfie with her. He sent the picture to the narrator's phone. The narrator opened the message. Staring back at him from the screen, smiling brightly next to Garrett, was the exact same woman who had been in his bed in New York City. He was 100%, unequivocally certain. Then, the true horror of the timeline set in. Garrett met this woman at a party in Hong Kong at 11. What? 0 p.m. on December 31st, Hong Kong time. The narrator met this woman at a party in Brooklyn at 11:30 p.m. on December 31st, New York time. Because of the 13-hour time difference, those two events occurred roughly 12.5 hours apart. A direct, non-stop commercial flight from Hong Kong to John F. Kennedy International Airport takes an absolute minimum of 15 to 16 hours. Factoring in travel to the airport, security, boarding, and travel from JFK to a rooftop party in Williamsburg, the journey requires nearly an entire day. Even if this woman had sprinted out of Garrett's apartment in Hong Kong at the crack of dawn, chartered a supersonic private jet, and flown directly to Brooklyn, the physics simply do not align. It is a literal, geographical impossibility for her to have been in both locations at those specific times. And even if you entirely ignore the impossibility of the travel time, how did she know to go to that specific party in Brooklyn? How did she magically gravitate directly toward the narrator, Garrett's best friend? Why did she recite the exact same biographical script to both of them? And most terrifyingly of all, how did she vanish from a locked apartment on the second floor, leaving the deadbolt engaged from the inside? They have spent the last year torturing themselves over these questions. They have scoured the internet, searching for artists in San Diego named Maitre Yi, searching for the cats, searching for the father. They have found absolutely nothing. She does not exist on paper. She did not exist on the flight manifests. Neither of them ever saw her again. As New Year's Eve approaches once more, the memory does not fade. It sharpens. The narrator sits in his apartment, staring at the locked door, grappling with a truth he cannot logically accept. He talked to her. He touched her. He washed her clothes. He does not believe in the paranormal. But when logic is eliminated, whatever remains, however impossible, must be the truth. And the only truth he is left with is the horrifying, freezing realization that last New Year's Eve, he invited a ghost into his home. For our final story, we step away from the city and travel back in time, back to the deep, silent woods of the American Northeast. Before the narrator of this account was even born, his parents were young, affluent, and hungry for adventure. His father had found significant success in business during his mid-20s, affording them the luxury of free time and disposable income. Their shared passion was skiing. Since they lived in the concrete grid of New York City, the only reliable access to high-quality alpine slopes was the long dark north into the mountainous heart of Vermont. They loved the area so much that they eventually transitioned from renting to owning. They purchased a ski lodge in a town called Ludlow, a dark, imposing structure they affectionately dubbed the Black House. They operated it like a timeshare with their inner circle, selling off quarter shares to close friends to offset the massive maintenance costs. A few years later, they upgraded. They sold the Black House and purchased a much more isolated property further north. It was located roughly halfway between Ludlow and Rutland, situated directly off the winding, treacherous asphalt of Route 100. The locals referred to this specific geographic pocket as the Lake District. It was a stunning, desolate stretch of wilderness where 5 massive, deep-water lakes sat in a row, separated by dense, ancient pine forests. The new lodge sat right on the precipice of one of these lakes. Its back deck practically hung over the water. The father's best friend since college was a man named Victor. Victor and his wife, Lisa, had gone in on the lake house investment with the mite. The two couples practically lived up there during the winter months. But on this particular New Year's Eve, the house was mostly empty. The narrator's mother and Victor's wife, Lisa, had traveled out of state to attend a friend's winter wedding. Left to their own devices, the narrator's father and Victor decided to head up to the Vermont Lodge to ring in the new year like a pair of bachelors. Just 2 old friends, a roaring fireplace, and a case of good beer. It was the night of December 31st. The temperature outside had plummeted well below zero. The lake, which stretched out for nearly a mile behind the house, was completely frozen solid. The ice was thick enough to drive a truck across. The architectural centerpiece of the lodge's second floor was a massive wall of floor-to-ceiling glass windows that offered an unobstructed, panoramic view of the lake and the distant tree line. The two men were upstairs, lounging in heavy armchairs by the glass. They had the radio dialed into a station broadcasting the build-up to the Times Square ball drop. They were deep in conversation, drinking beer, and watching the snow drift down over the ice. The father always described the atmosphere of that night as profoundly peaceful. It was the kind of deep, isolated quiet that makes you feel incredibly small, but entirely safe. They were halfway through a story when the world outside the glass exploded. A colossal, blinding flash of pure white light erupted from somewhere on the far side of the frozen lake. It was so intensely bright that the father reflexively threw his arm over his eyes. His immediate, logical thought was that someone had detonated commercial-grade fireworks. But as his vision cleared, he realized two deeply unsettling things. First, there was absolutely no sound. Like, no crack of gunpowder echoing through the valley. Second, the light had not come from the sky. It had ignited from the ground up, illuminating the falling snow from below. Victor slowly stood up from his chair, his beer forgotten on the table. He walked until his face was inches from the cold glass, peering out into the darkness settling back over the lake. The father asked him what he was looking at. Like, Victor's voice was tense. He pointed a finger at the center of the lake. He said, with absolute certainty, that he saw something moving out there on the ice. The father scoffed. He stood up and joined Victor at the window, straining his eyes. The ambient light from the snow cover I saw for decent visibility. But he saw nothing. He told Victor he was hallucinating. He reminded his friend of the geography of their location. There were no neighboring cabins on the far side of that lake. There were no access roads. There were no hiking trails. The opposite bank was nothing but miles of brutal, untamed wilderness. Light. No one was out there. But Victor was not deterred. He turned away from the glass, his jaw set, and began aggressively shoving his arms into his heavy winter coat and pulling on his insulated boots. He announced he was going out there to check. The father tried to talk him down, calling him crazy, but Victor was already jogging down the wooden staircase. Cursing under his breath, the father grabbed his own jacket and followed his friend down to the first floor. The two men unlocked the sliding glass door and stepped out onto the back deck. The biting wind hit them immediately, stealing the breath from their lungs. They stood shoulder to shoulder in the dark, staring out at the frozen expanse. And then, they heard it. Carried on the freezing wind, drifting across the solid ice, came a voice. It was high-pitched. It was desperate. It was the unmistakable, fragile voice of a little boy. He was screaming, "Help!" over and over again. "Help!" The father felt his stomach drop into his boots. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind groaning through the trees. It was a human child, alone, in sub-zero temperatures, standing somewhere in the middle of a frozen lake at midnight. All hesitation vanished. The men didn't stop to grab flashlights. They didn't stop to think about the danger. They vaulted over the wooden railing of the deck and hit the snow-covered ice at a dead run. Like, their boots crunched loudly in the silent night as they pushed toward the center of the lake. The voice was getting closer, still crying out into the dark. As they closed the distance, their eyes adjusted before that night. Roughly 30 yards ahead of them, standing perfectly still on the flat expanse of white ice, was a figure. It was incredibly small, the silhouette of a child, standing completely alone. The father opened his mouth to shout, to tell the boy that they were coming, that he was safe. He never got the words out. The second blinding flash detonated. It was infinitely brighter than the first. It was a searing, magnesium-white explosion of light that seemed to swallow the entire world. It was so intense, so physically agonizing to look at, that the father cried out, threw his hands over his face, and dropped heavily to his knees on the hard ice. The world went pitch black behind his eyelids. He stayed kneeling for several agonizing seconds, his retinas burning, waiting for the thunderous boom that surely had to follow a light of that magnitude. But the silence remained absolute. Slowly, painfully, he lowered his hands and forced his eyes open. He blinked away the purple spots dancing in his vision. He looked up, expecting to see Victor, expecting to see the frightened child standing in the snow. The ice was empty. There was no child. There were no footprints leading away. There was nothing but the vast, terrifying emptiness of the frozen lake. The protective instincts that had driven them out onto the ice instantly evaporated, replaced by a cold, primal, suffocating terror. This was not a rescue mission. Something was deeply, horrifically wrong. The father scrambled to his feet. He looked at Victor, whose face was pale and slick with panic sweat. Without exchanging a single word, the two grown men turned their backs to the center of the lake and began sprinting toward the safety of the lodge. They ran with reckless abandon, slipping and sliding on the ice, desperate to put a solid wall between them and whatever was out there. Victor was faster. He reached the snowy bank of the property first. But as he scrambled up the incline toward the deck, he suddenly stopped dead. He let out a choked yell and pointed a trembling finger upward.